to start with a story that I like very much. It's one I've told before because it really resonates with me. Two monks from a Christian community are walking out in the countryside, and they come across a river that is absolutely swollen because of recent flooding. The waters are just raging, and they know they're going to have a tough time getting over to where they need to be because they have to cross the river. And there off to the side is a woman who is already stymied. She has to get home to her family, but the water is so rapid that she has no way to get across. And so, not having to think about this very much, one of the monks walks over and talks to her, places the woman on his shoulders, and carries her across the river. And when they get to the other side, he puts the woman down. They go on their separate ways, this woman and these men. Sometime later, miles later, in fact, one of the Christian brothers says to his friend, "I cannot believe that you picked up that woman. You know that we are forbidden to have any physical contact with women." And the guilty party looked at his friend and said, "I put that woman down an hour ago, and you are still carrying her." Do you see what he was saying? When we lose sight of the fact that rules are always there for a reason, when we make the rules the be-all and the end-all instead of the reason and the rationale while they're there in the first place, then that is a problem for us. And sometimes what we see, not just in the church but in society as a whole, is that there is almost this reverence for the rules that makes absolutely no sense. And that is exactly what Jesus is going to take on in the story from Mark chapter 3. But to set the context, we have to go back just a little bit into chapter 2, and it ends this way. Jesus is talking to the religious leaders, the churchy people, and he says, "The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of the people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, and he's Lord even of the Sabbath." He's not bound by these rules. He's not having to pledge allegiance to rules that he himself is responsible for. And that sets up what is happening in the next part, in the early part of chapter 3. And this is what the story says. Jesus went into the synagogue again, and he noticed a man with a deformed hand. And since it was the Sabbath, that would be our Saturday, Jesus' enemies watched him closely, because if he healed the man's hand, they planned to accuse him of working on the Sabbath. And of course, the Jews were not to do any kind of work on the Sabbath at all. Jesus said to the man with the deformed hand, "Come and stand in front of everyone." Then he turned to his critics and he asked, "Does the law permit good deeds on the Sabbath, or is it a day for doing evil? Or is it a day to save life or destroy it?" But they wouldn't answer him. He looked around at them, and he was angry, and he was deeply saddened by their hard hearts. And then he said to the man, "Hold out your hand." So the man held out his hand, and it was restored. And at once the Pharisees went away, and they met with the supporters of Herod to plot how to kill Jesus. Well, you can see why these people were feeling threatened. This man, as we've already seen earlier in Mark, teaches with authority. He has credibility. He has authenticity. He has a way about him that is vastly different from anything they've ever seen before. And it resonates in the hearts of the people. And so the establishment, the religious leaders are feeling threatened. They're defensive. They're jealous. And they're concerned. Part of that concern is okay. As we talked about earlier, it was their job to make sure that whoever presented himself as a teacher of the truth was doing exactly that, teaching the truth. But as we're about to see in this story, there is another layer of nuance here that really adds a measure of understanding to precisely what's going on in this story. But at the beginning, at least, these people want to know what is going on, and they really don't know what to make of Jesus. So he makes this central point that he's already made in chapter 2, and that is that people are more important than proclamations and prohibitions. That's point number one for us. People and love are more important than proclamations and prohibitions, because those prohibitions, when they are recorded for us, in Scripture are there for a reason. And they are never going to make us choose between love and people and doing the right thing. Because loving people and putting people first is doing the right thing in every case. In every case. And so what we have to understand is that the legalism we're talking about here is the kind that would bind rules on people or take things to ridiculous lengths when there's absolutely no scriptural authority for that. And that happens all the time. All the time. One of the things I learned as a young married man is that there are unwritten rules in every relationship. You know that, right? Nobody writes these things down, but there are unwritten rules in every relationship. I did not know that when Susan came to me and voiced frustration over or in something or someone, that was not a cue for me to say, well, then why didn't you just say or do this? And then you wouldn't have that problem. I didn't know that. I didn't know. I should have, but I didn't know that men and women don't operate the same. You know, if I have a problem with one of my guy friends, the discussion might get a little heated. It might get a bit heavy. It might even be rancorous. But ultimately, one of us is going to say, well, that was stupid. Let's go eat. And it will be over. Not so with women. When I first got married, I learned that if I made Susan angry enough, it was like Wyerton Willie and his shadow, because I was in for 6 weeks of winter, and it was going to be frostier in the house than it was going to be outside. Because you don't operate the way we do. Nobody told me that. That was something I had to figure out myself. And I did not know that if my gotchis end up on the bedroom floor in front of the hamper because I have missed playing underwear basketball, I'm not allowed to leave them there. The reality is that churches have unwritten rules too. Lots of unwritten rules, and they vary from congregation to congregation. It may be the way you're supposed to dress. It may be how much you're supposed to give. It may even be where you're supposed to sit, because there are some places where you can't sit where you'd like to sit because, well, some family's been sitting there for generations. Those things are pretty petty, but they do have an influence on how people respond to God. And one of the things we do not want to do is to send the message that God is all about the rules, because that's what a lot of people out there already think. Now look, there are lots of ways that you can look at this book. Maybe for you, it is a light, a map, a compass. It's something that helps you find your way through life. Maybe this is a love letter from God. Maybe it's a mirror so that you can see yourself as you were and as you are and as you hope to be. But I'm telling you now, if your primary view of this book is that it's just rules and regulations, you have the emphasis entirely on the wrong syllable, and you will do unmitigated harm to yourself and to other people if that's your concept of who God is and what he wants in this life. So here's the question I want you to explain for me. What is the biggest problem? And there are several aspects of this, but what are the biggest problems with seeing legalism as superior to love and relationship? What trouble does legalism get us to if we're so intent on following the rules that we lose sight of everything else? Tell me. Yeah. And what happens if you can't live up to them? Yeah. You're going to feel bad about that. There are lots of times when we make good decisions, but sometimes when we try to put some rules with that, it just changes the whole nature and complexion of what you're trying to accomplish. I learned that as a runner. If I start saying, I'm going to run every single day, and I've done this, and I'm not going to let anything stop me. I've literally been out running the streets with a plastic bag because I was so ill that I was going to have to use it before I got home. Does that make any sense to you? It's a stupid rule. You have to cut yourself some slack. Some rules are good, some rules are not so good. So yes, if you can't keep the rules that you make, especially if they're unrealistic for you, that's going to lead you to problems. But that's not the only problem. What else?
Destroys relationships.
How so? Yes, it does destroy relationships. Explain to me how.
We're called to love one another.
Exactly. We have to be careful to understand that relationship is a lot more than just following the rules. Do you realize that if spirituality was only about your ability to do what you were supposed to do in every measure, if it was only about keeping the rules, you could train a computer to be spiritual. Now, don't just pass over that. I want you to think about that for a minute. If all our relationship with God was about keeping rules, then even a machine could do that. Is that really what we're called to? Well, of course not. It's about relationship. It's about doing what we need to do, doing the right thing, because we love God and we love each other and we want to honor and submit to that love. So yeah, it has to be about more than just keeping the rules, because that will numb a relationship. Just think about being in a marriage or a friendship or a corporate situation where you're only doing what you're doing because, well, you have no choice. That's the rule. And so you're going to do that. It's a joyless experience. What else is wrong? Yeah. I thought a lot about that this week. And in case you didn't hear that, if we are so bound up in the rules, we often stop thinking, and then we start to judge other people harshly when they don't follow the same set of rules that we do. You really can't win with legalism, because if you are successful in keeping the rules, including the rules that don't need to be there in the first place, well, then that's going to lead to pride and arrogance. Because the next step after you feel so good about doing what it is that you're doing is to look at others and see that they are not meeting your standards or your preferences or whatever you think they should be doing. So if it doesn't lead to pride on this side, it's going to lead to that arrogance over here and harsh judgment that often creeps in. And if you cannot keep the rules, that just leads to discouragement and ultimately to despair. And either way, whether it's this extreme or that one, you do not have any joy. You do not have any life. You don't really have a relationship. You've got a contract. A binding contract. Because one of the problems with legalism and all those regulations is that sometimes you can't be sure that you've done everything that you need to do. And then that calls into question your faith or your salvation. One of the reasons why legalism doesn't work is because God doesn't use it with us. You're not going to be in the presence of God eternally because you kept all the rules, because you can't do that. And the Bible makes it clear that if you can't keep all of the rules perfectly, you cannot be in the presence of a perfect God. And so if we can't get there on our own, if we recognize and we acknowledge that we are beholden to Christ to get us to God and to allow us to stay there, then why would we want to poison our relationships here with a multitude of regulations and rules that have no place? It has to be about people first. That's one of the things that upsets Jesus here. He says, this man is more important than the rules that you have put in place. The Pharisees had 613 regulations that they had added to the law, which made it almost impossible, as Susan already pointed out, to keep the rules the way that the establishment said you were supposed to. Imagine 613 rules and regulations. It's Matthew 23 that she was referring to, where Jesus tears apart the Pharisees for their hypocrisy, because he knows that at the heart of the whole matter, their hearts are absent. They don't care about the people. And that's the case here. These Pharisees, these religious leaders are not concerned about the welfare of this man with the withered hand. They're trying to make a point, they're trying to score points, and they want to win the argument. And that's why this is so damaging. Point number one, people and love are more important than proclamations and prohibitions. Number two, motives matter. How does Jesus react to this? What does it say he reacted like? Two things.
Angry.
He was really angry. Why?
Because they weren't loving.
That's right. He was angry because they were not loving and they were not concerned about the welfare of this man. But secondly, he was grieving. It's a good word. It says that his heart was very sad. Why?
Hardness of their hearts.
The hardness of their hearts.
And it can lead to violence.
it can lead to all kinds of things, not just harsh judgment, not just pride and arrogance, but exclusion. There are lots of religious communities where if you don't toe the line, if you don't meet the mark, then you're out. And that's mild compared to what happens in other cases. In my former life as a reporter, I spent a lot of time in northern Uganda dealing with a group called the Lord's Resistance Army. These were people who mutilated and maimed people all over that country because they were intent on establishing the 10 Commandments as the foundation for government in Uganda. And if you didn't do what they thought you should be doing, they cut off your hands, or they removed your nose and your ears, or they took your kids and turned them into sex slaves or child soldiers. They were following the rules. Heaven help you if you didn't follow them too in the way that they wanted you to. That, on the extreme end, is what happens when we allow legalism to take root in our hearts. Jesus is angry. He's justifiably angry because these people should not be reacting the way they are. There is a time and a place for your righteous indignation. Anger is a sign that something is wrong, and God can use anger to stir us up and to get us to a place where we're actually willing to do something about things that are not supposed to be there in the first place. But let me tell you this. If your primary emotion, when you're dealing with people who are not doing what they should be, if your primary emotion is anger instead of a sad heart, that's a dangerous thing. Tell me the difference between reacting to somebody out of anger and reacting out of sadness. Tell me why we need to be reacting out of sadness more than anger. Exactly. When we react out of anger, what we're doing is we're putting ourselves in place as judge and jury. Our standard, our preference, our feelings are the only thing that matter. We're not concerned about the other people. When we have a sadness, a heaviness that comes of knowing that somebody is hurt or broken or somebody is misguided, if we can cut them some slack and have some sympathy and empathy for them, then we're able to look at them in a gentle and a humble way, a loving way that has a much better chance of transforming their attitudes and their behavior and their lives, as opposed to just being so angry that all you can do is disdain their actions and walk away from them. Oh, let me tell you, this has really been put to the test for me. I'm very upset, and you probably are too, about a lot of what's happening in the political world right now. And I don't really, frankly, care where you stand on that. I just know that whatever is happening is not good for anybody. And I think we should all be able to agree on that. I am having real problems reacting out of love instead of anger. It is starting to really impair my ability to look at things and to look at certain people in certain ways. And I recognize that. And I'm working on that. Because I also fundamentally understand that if I allow myself to be mostly angry instead of hurt or sad, then I am going to ultimately move from anger into resentment, and from resentment into bitterness, because that, ladies and gentlemen, is the progression. When you stay angry long enough, it eats into your heart, and then it moves into your spirit, and that dictates who you are and what you become.
Amen.
So number 2, Jesus says motives matter. When you're right ready to go after somebody, when you're prone to cast judgment, step back, take a look at the situation and try to determine why this person is feeling or doing what they are. Try to find the empathy, that gentleness, and that love that we talked about earlier, and it will alter your perception, not just of that person, but also your perception of God. Because if you begin with the fundamental principle which says, God forgives me, God is going to love me regardless of me, in spite of me, that should make it easier for us to do the same with other people in our lives, especially the difficult ones. Always, always remember that motives matter. Jesus has a right to be angry, but notice he doesn't stay there. He's candid, He is absolutely transparent. He's clear about what needs to happen here. And he doesn't have to castigate them. He's made their hypocrisy clear already. He was deeply saddened by their hard hearts. And then he just doesn't lecture them. He just proves his power. He has the man stand in front of them. He heals this man of his withered hand. And if you're wondering, well, why don't these people, if they're so angry with Jesus, why don't they just go after him now? Here's your answer. Jesus went out to the lake with his disciples right after this, and a large crowd followed him. And they came from all over Galilee, Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, from east of the Jordan River, and as far as Tyre and Sidon, which is all the way up in Lebanon. The news about his miracles had spread far and wide, and vast numbers of people came to see him. Jesus instructed his disciples to have a boat ready so the crowds would not crush him. He'd healed so many people that day, that all the sick people eagerly pushed toward him to touch him. And whenever those possessed by evil spirits caught sight of him, the spirits would throw themselves to the ground in front of him, shrieking, "You are the Son of God." But Jesus sternly commanded the spirits not to reveal who he was. The third lesson I get out of this, after people before prohibitions and after motives matter, is we need to develop a healthy set of expectations. And I referred to this a couple of weeks ago, but can you say to yourself with some honesty that you're prepared to be disappointed in and with God? Are you disappointed? And can you be upfront about that when God doesn't do what you want him to? I hope that you can be honest about those things, because that's going to happen. That's just the way life is. I think you're right about that, because even if we don't say the words out loud, we know what we're feeling, right?
Yes.
And if God is God, he's a great big God. His shoulders are broad. His love is vast. He's not going to be angry at you for being disappointed. He understands that this is a growth process. This is a maturing, deepening process that never comes quickly or easily. Most people start out, as we said a couple of weeks ago, just wanting God to fix everything. And that's valid. That's legit. Don't you want that too? Don't you want your health to be okay? Your finances to be good? Your kids to be well adjusted? Don't you want things to be easier than they are? Yes, you do. Sometimes God will give you that. But we need to reach way past that superficial view of God as the great giver of gifts, and only that. And see that what he really wants is wholeness and holiness, which is the whole point of this story. Jesus doesn't stay on the shore and heal all these people, because that's not what he's here for. A lot of people that day probably walked away without the physical touch. And what was Jesus doing instead? What was he doing in the boat? He was preaching. He was talking about God's love. He was talking about sin. He was talking about redemption. How do I know that? Well, because that is the gospel. He knows that in some measure, this will be the only time he connects with some of these people. I don't think he's wasting time talking about secondary issues. He's there to talk to them about the love of God, which transforms the world and their lives. We need to be sure that we have a mature set of expectations, that God will start with our holiness and our wholeness. And sometimes, yes, sometimes he will give us the miracles that we want because he loves us that much. But it can't be about God giving us everything we want, or the only reason people would follow him would be just that, to get whatever it is that they want. The last thing I see here is a sense of timing. Jesus is very clear that he's in control. He has demonstrated control over the elements, over temptation, demonstrated control over the devil, demonstrated control over disease, and he will demonstrate control over death. But everything in its own time. Jesus is not wanting to lose control of the situation in terms of having so many people follow him that it gets in the way of what he's come to do. He needs time and opportunity to preach. And so he's telling people at this point, even the demons that he talks about here, just be quiet. He needs time for things to unfold. But there will be a time when he wants everyone to know who he is. And that time is now. Because our job, our role, our real mission is to make sure that we communicate the same things that Jesus did. That first and foremost, God is about love. God loves us so much that he wants us to be reunited with him for eternity. And so he's willing to send his son to the cross to pay the price for your sin and for mine, which means that it's not about your ability to follow the rules. So if you've been down on yourself lately because you have been messing up more, or maybe even as much as you always have, you need to understand that that in no way impairs God's love for you. When God looks at you, there are times when he's going to be angry at what you do too, especially when it's willful and it's intentional. But that love is never, ever overshadowed by God's anger. He loves you first and foremost. Anger may be part of what you bring out in him, but never to the point where it gets rid of the love that he holds for us. Never. I wonder if we can say the same thing. Can we say that we will be people who will hold true to our convictions, who will uphold the commandments of Jesus, but still be willing to show the grace and the mercy, the love that Jesus did? If we will do that, then we won't have to argue about the rules. The rules will fall into place because they will be couched and they will be controlled by love. But if we elevate the letter of the law, we know that the letter of the law kills, and the spirit of the law brings freedom. Give yourself a break. Give yourself some time to get to where God will ultimately get you. As long as you're taking your sin seriously, God will do the rest. God will do the rest. If you come to him with a physical problem this week, your version of the withered hand, maybe Jesus will miraculously heal that. Maybe. But if you come to Jesus this week with a withered heart, now that's something he will always do something about.